Hello, guys. So let's get into our 8.1 through 8.4 reading. So our first chapter for Unit 8 starts in the Cold War. The two big areas that Unit 8 covers are the Cold War and then decolonization. It's one of those global units that doesn't really like Unit 7 is like really kind of focused on these like one event, these events like the World Wars. But Unit 8 kind of is like one of those units that like talks about all these places all at once. And so there's going to be a lot more repetition. Like what we saw like in Unit 4 or in Unit 6 and stuff like that. So here are our terms. Let me move my face. Let's move my face. Oh, that's it. Oh my gosh, that's it. I forgot there's only 11 terms. Okay, so let's get into the reading. If we recall going into World War II, right, the alliances that were against the Axis powers, there were kind of two political ideologies that made that alliance system up. It was the communism and then the capitalist democratic West. And they were unified in their animosity towards fascism. But when fascism was defeated, the intrinsic limits to how these ideologies can work together became more apparent. But let's kind of talk about like the process of how these things evolve. So the big three nations, U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, are kind of the most important figures of the war effort because they have the most resources. But also, in general, if we just look at the investment of resources, the U.S. and the Soviet Union commit around the same amount of resources, albeit in different ways. Like specifically, the Soviet Union invests far more manpower into the war than any other group, but economically, the U.S. invests far more resources into the war. And so that leads to a disparity between who has leverage and who does not. And our first example of our disparity would be the Tehran Conference, which is in Iran, where because the Soviets' interests were more focused in Europe, they advocated for focusing the war in Europe before the alliance directed its resources towards the conflict in the Pacific. And because the Soviets had so much more manpower and were in many ways bearing the brunt of the fighting, the Allies kind of could not afford to not appease the Soviets in that way. So also, this important to the Soviets guaranteed they'd get some of the territory they lost to Poland as a consequence of the Russian Civil War and things like that. And then D-Day happens and all the war progresses and it becomes pretty clear that the Allies are going to win, but they still need to figure out what to do about like the post-war world. And so they meet in Yalta, which is in modern-day Ukraine, in modern-day Crimea. And the U.S. wants their kind of goal is to make a democratic world, a more democratic world by having elections. But they also want the Soviet support in the Pacific War. And the Soviets' interests are really to use this opportunity of World War II to expand their own influence. So at Potsdam, the Soviets are given, again, more things to guarantee their cooperation, specifically guarantee their cooperation in the Pacific theater when the war in Europe ends, right? So the Soviets promise that when Germany is defeated and when Italy is defeated, they will go help fight the war in Asia. And that comes at the price of the Allies giving the Soviets a lot of what they wanted. And so the Allies give in there. When Potsdam happens, which is in the Netherlands, it kind of really falls apart in terms of guaranteeing a equitable peace in many ways. Because as the Soviets have expanded across Eastern Europe, they're now occupying many of these countries that are supposed to have democratic elections. And these countries do have elections. It's just for whatever reason, 110% of the population wants to become communist, right? It's kind of like those kind of elections. It's hyperbole. But examples like that are happening like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary as well as the war wraps up and into the post-war period. In many ways, though, the Yalta Plan is carried out. Like Germany is partitioned into into this kind of joint occupation. Germany is like demilitarized and deindustrialized in a way. But how the Soviets go about following the letter to the agreement, but not actually carrying out the spirit of the agreement, really erodes the trust between the Allies and the Soviet Union. So, another kind of big element to this would be that as a consequence of World War I, the balance of power over the most powerful countries in the world has finally shifted outside of continental Europe and into this massive nation, the Soviet Union, and then the United States across the Atlantic. This mainly happens because a great deal of the fighting occurred on continental Europe. So France was a source of fighting. Italy was a source of fighting. Germany was a source of fighting. And even Great Britain experienced aerial bombardment for a period of time. And also the Soviet Union, right? And population-wise, countries like Poland, the Soviet Union, and Germany lose about a fifth of their populations each. And this leads to a lot more economic instability, demographic instability. A lot more men have died, right? So there's there's a gender gap now. Despite that instability, Britain and France maintain democracies. But Europe in general is less politically stable in that post-war period than they were before. In general, though, the big rivalry that develops is that the U.S. is a country that was not at all economically damaged in the conflict. So they're ready. They could go another war, right? They actually have the manpower to do it and everything. Also, their success in developing atomic weapons gives them a distinct advantage over any other country that seeks to test them, right? So say the Soviets didn't want to follow through on all the plans that were made after World War II. America could nuke them, right? And the Soviets could not do anything back, right? So that's a pretty powerful That's a pretty powerful discrepancy in the what tools each nation has, right? But economically, demographically, and then eventually technologically, the Soviets do have the means to challenge the Americans, especially because of their proximity to Europe, right? Also some other things that happened is that just the nature of war accelerated so many other technological advances in addition to nuclear technology. One notable one would be the breadth of the use of penicillin, and then also vaccines becoming more accessible as well. So the Cold War, there's a pretty big historical debate over when the Cold War actually begins. You could say it begins in May of 45, in August of 45. It could say it begins with the detonation of the first hydrogen bomb. It really all depends on who you ask. What's so important about the Cold War is that despite it not being ever a formal declaration of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, these countries operate as if the other are their adversary, and that in many ways obstructing or interfering with the advancement of their enemy's goals was good for them, right? But just making America weaker or the Soviets weaker, that advanced the other nation's interests, right? When the Soviets detonate a hydrogen bomb, which is a weapon that is more destructive than a fission bomb, which was like the bomb, a uranium bomb, which was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because a hydrogen bomb uses the process of fusion, which produces far more energy than fission, which is when you divide an atom to release energy. The fusion is when you combine atoms to and that creates energy as well. And when the Soviets get access to that technology, it then becomes possible for what happened to Japan to happen to America, right? Because that wouldn't have happened with just America controlling nukes, right? And in that reality, America feels more threatened, right? And that innately escalates the prevalence of militarism within American society, because without a strong military, we can't protect ourselves from nuclear eradication, and we have all these ideological and geopolitical conflicts with the Soviet Union And so this militarism leads to a part of the American industry that in some ways is dependent on this militaristic ideology persisting, right? And so President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned of the rise of this military industrial complex in which parts of the American economy depend on us being afraid and also us being ready to fight a war, which means that we have a part of the economy that advocates for a constant state of war, which is not necessarily a great thing. And then the final thing to talk about is something you guys could already infer that I've already set up for you guys in previous videos. These empires that predated America and the Soviet Union's ascendancy after World War II, like Britain and France, now no longer have the resources to maintain their control over these subject people. And also, the seeds planted in the destabilization of World War I and just the assimilation process with European culture and norms increase this advocacy for self-determination, right? So these people are like, we should govern ourselves. And the way you talk about things like the basic rights of humans means we should have them say over how we are governed, right? So that those movements grow across the planet. The World War weakens Great Britain and France innately, so they cannot effectively suppress that self-determination movement. And the Americans and the Soviet Union are looking for more allies across the world to resist the spread of those opposing ideologies. And so they seek to also free those nations so they have allies on their side as well. The US is more like we give them freedom because if we don't, those self-determination movements will become more radicalized and find communism to be more attractive, where communism itself is innately against imperialism or against European imperialism and stuff like that, and exploitation, right? So they also ideologically were opposed to it. So that's our first video. Only 12 minutes. 3 more to go. And the next one's going to be the long one, though. All right, see you guys then.